On Thursday, the 20th of September 1900, 500 Parisians wandered into the Vélodrome de Vincennes, expecting to see an exhibition football match between England and France. Instead, they accidentally witnessed Great Britain winning the first ever Olympic football tournament. And by Great Britain, I mean an amateur side from East London, Upton Park Football Club. Not West Ham United, not West Ham Stadium, again. A nomadic amateur side who essentially stumbled into Olympic history because they were in the right place at the right time. So who were Upton Park Football Club? Well, that itself is going to take some explaining. There have been 3 different iterations of Upton Park, a bit like the footballing equivalent of Mick Foley. Upton Park V1 was founded in 1866. They played their games in West Ham Park, right next to the historic home of Clapton FC, the old Spotted Dog ground. The club was mostly made up of middle-class ex-public schoolboys who thought participating in football was good for their moral character and, as such, would go on to maintain a strong amateur-only ethos, which would be important later. In 1871, Upton Park FC were one of 15 teams to enter the inaugural FA Cup, and even have the fame, or infamy depending on which way you look at it, of conceding the first ever goal in FA Cup history, scored by Jarvis Kenrick of Clapton Rovers. Upton Park FC were considered a pretty decent outfit on the pitch and would prove to be influential off it as well. They would soon have a hand in shaping the game that we all know and love today. In 1870, they, along with others, proposed an amendment to the Football Association's laws of the game. Handling the ball under any pretense whatsoever should be prohibited, which, interestingly enough, came a year before goalkeepers were added to the FA rulebook. The Uptonians, as they were unfortunately called, continued to tick along into the 1880s. They would win the first 2 London Senior Cups, but their next big-ish contribution to football history would come in 1884, after a draw in the FA Cup against Preston North End. Being staunchly amateurs only and sticklers for the rules, they complained to the FA that Preston had secretly been paying some of their players, which was a real no-no at the time. Preston North End were booted out of the FA Cup. Preston secretary William Soodle led the club along with a number of other teams to form a breakaway association, which would force the FA to legalise the employment of professional players a year later. So, in many ways, Upton Park helped accelerate football's move towards professionalism and, by extension, the over-commercialisation of the game that we all know and love today. You're welcome. Content with their impact on the beautiful game, in September 1887, the first edition of the club shut up shop, only to get resurrected 4 years later when another local club, Belmont FC, decided they liked the Upton Park name much better than theirs, and nicked it. Upton Park Mark II was kinda born in 1891. Not so new, not so improved. The updated version of the club was best described as unremarkable. They entered the one and only season of the Southern Alliance League in 1892, finishing last, losing all but either 1 or 2 of their matches depending on which newspaper you read. In the mid-1890s, not happy with their current HQ, the Rising Sun Ground in Forest Gate, they packed up their things and left, effectively making themselves homeless. Rather than search for new digs, the club decided to not bother themselves with the hassle of a home stadium and essentially treated all their fixtures as away games. Things looked rather bleak for Upton Park too. That was until 1896, when James Harry Jones arrived. James Jones was the club's goalkeeper and secretary, which in practice meant travel agent, fundraiser, kit man, half-time orange supplier, and general saviour. Where others saw problems, Jones saw opportunity. With no ties to anywhere, why not turn Upton Park into a backpacking touring side and see some of the country while they were at it? From 1897, Upton Park FC embarked on a number of tours, taking them to the exotic lands of Wiltshire, Dorset, Somerset, the Channel Islands, and even France. By the late 1800s, this odd East London club, a little like Euskadi but minus all the war, had turned into a sort of Victorian Harlem Globetrotters. They didn't win trophies on these tours, but they did at least rack up some air miles, or whatever the equivalent was in third-class train tickets. So, when the FA needed someone to represent Great Britain in the amateur football event at the 1900 Paris Exposition, which would be hosting the events of the 1900 Olympics, who better than Upton Park? Well, actually, a lot of teams were better than Upton Park. But they were willing, available, and already seasoned in trips to the continent. For the FA, they might not have been the best option, but they were at least the simplest option. In September 1900, Upton Park FC set off on their 4th annual tour to Dorset, the Channel Islands, and then to France, to coincide with their date with Olympic history. So the 1900 Summer Games is to the Olympics what the Star Wars Holiday Special is to the Star Wars franchise. It happened, kind of exists in the same universe, but they'd rather not talk about it. Held as part of the 1900 Paris Exposition, or World's Fair, most athletes would have no idea they were even at the Olympics at all. Instead, they thought they were competing in the less catchy and much longer titled International Physical Exercise and Sporting Competitions of the Universal Exhibition. In short, the International Olympic Committee and the organisers of the Paris Exposition were in loggerheads about who should be in charge of Olympic sports at the World's Fair. The Expo organisers won out, lumped in the Olympic events with some other sporting exhibitions they were showcasing, and went from there. Alongside familiar sports that you might expect to see at the Summer Games, there was also a series of less Olympic-y contests. Croquet, angling, tug-of-war, balls, ballooning, motor racing, motorcycle racing, pigeon racing, horse long jump, horse high jump, firefighting, life-saving, basque pelota, and my personal favourite, the 200-metre swimming obstacle race. As you might suspect, not all of these today are considered canon. Football was on the programme, but like everything else, it was somewhat all over Ligue F. Originally, the event was supposed to feature teams representing France, Switzerland, Belgium, Germany, and Great Britain. Then Germany and Switzerland pulled out at the last minute, so instead of a proper event, there were just 2 matches. France versus Great Britain and France versus Belgium. That was it. No Great Britain versus Belgium match, presumably the organisers couldn't be asked. With this amateur footballing exhibition shrunk, the French organisers, perhaps sensing that they might be able to return the training cones to the shops if they wrapped things up quick enough, brought the fixtures forwards. Upton Park were originally penned in to play France on October 7th, but with Germany and Switzerland AWOL, they were bumped up the cards to play the opening match on September 20th. The problem being, they were still in Guernsey at the time. So the Upton Park players dropped their Channel Island fixtures, got on a ferry to St Malo, caught an overnight train, and arrived in Paris in the early hours of Thursday the 20th of September. This perhaps wasn't the best preparation for a British Olympic squad, as their game was due to kick off at 2 p.m. The French press, still confused about who was playing, advertised the fixture as France versus England and described Upton Park as a first-class English side, which was an optimistic bit of marketing. Still, it was good enough to entice 500 spectators to the Vélodrome de Vincennes to see France, represented by Club Français Paris, play Great Britain's finest. Not so much. For comparison, Upton Park's opponents that day, Club Français Paris, had just finished as runners-up of the US FSA Championship, the top level of French football at the time, and had previously won the thing as recently as 1896, so not exactly a hastily put-together pub team. But despite the lack of sleep and preparation, Upton Park FC, representing Great Britain, beat the French side 4-0. Goals from John Nicholas, Walter John Zealey, and Richard Turner put the club in the history books. Just like that, Upton Park FC had unknowingly become the first Olympic football champions. Of course, nobody called them that in 1900. They were just the winners of an exhibition match in Paris. The French side went on to wallop Belgium, either 6-2 or 7-4, depending on which match report you read, and that, for some reason, was the end of the footballing event at the 1900 Summer Games. But rather than savour this historic victory, or attempt to catch up on some sleep at least, it was back to business for Upton Park FC, because 2 days later, Upton Park had an FA Cup tie scheduled back in London, against a team called Olympic. Are you taking the So several players left Paris immediately after the match, rushed back across the channel, and turned out for the FA Cup. Exhausted and having to bring in some ringers, Upton Park were battered 6-0 by Olympic, ending their FA Cup dream for another year. But there was no stopping the lads on tour. After losing to Olympic in London, they headed straight back to France, rejoined the rest of their touring party, and picked up where they left off. For them, Paris was just one stop on their footballing tour de force, which may seem strange when you think about how gargantuan the Olympics are in this day and age, but it was very different a century ago, particularly in 1900 when things were a lot more improvised. Next to no organisation, no medals awarded, no opening ceremony, which is the best thing about the Olympics. The 1900 Games didn't yet have the appeal and gravitas that the Olympics of modern day do. The International Olympic Committee would only years later decree that Upton Park, aka Great Britain, had won gold, France silver, and Belgium bronze. Upton Park carried on their footballing adventure for another decade. As well as visiting their usual haunts, the team also added Belgium to their list of tour dates, and even went to Norfolk once. In 1906, to celebrate their 10th tour of the Channel Islands, Upton Park FC donated a trophy to the Guernsey FA, the creatively named Upton Park Trophy, which is still contested every year between the champions of Guernsey and Jersey. By 1910, the touring schedule finally caught up with the players. They were absolutely knackered. James Harry Jones retired from football, and the club soon folded for a second time around 1911. And yet, the name Upton Park lived on. As well as the aforementioned trophy, West Ham United would play at the Boleyn Ground, aka Upton Park, for 112 years, until West Ham moved to the Olympic Stadium in 2016, which has some kind of nice football symbolism, I guess. Upton Park FC entered its third form when it was reborn in 2016, not really with the intention of joining the footballing pyramid, but to keep the spirit of the old club alive by playing friendlies, often charity games, sometimes in places the old club once toured, a bit like a heritage site with shin pads. So next time you see a list of Olympic football winners and notice Great Britain 1900, remember they weren't a national team, they were an amateur club from East London, Upton Park. They weren't the best amateurs in the country, they were just a nomadic side who happened to be in the right place at the right time, agreed to play, and then went down in football history. Kind of.